My boyfriend spent years smashing my belongings to ease his anger, but the day he destroyed the last thing I had from my dead mom, I finally snapped. When Derek and I first moved in together, he was the sweetest guy who'd help me decorate and actually cared about making the apartment feel like home. I had my grandmother's vintage mirror, my book collection from college, plants I'd grown from seeds, and this ceramic pot my mom had made in her pottery class a month before she died from cancer. She'd painted little sunflowers on it and written my name on the bottom. It was the last thing she ever gave me. Derek would water the plant in it and say how talented my mom had been. For 6 months, everything was perfect until Derek got stressed about a work project and threw my coffee mug against the wall during an argument. He immediately apologized, said he didn't know what came over him, bought me 10 new mugs the next day. I should have left then, but he seemed so sorry and said it would never happen again. The second time, he was mad about traffic and threw my laptop across the room. It shattered completely. When I cried about losing all my photos and documents, he said I was being materialistic, and it was just a machine. He said his anger was justified because the world was frustrating and I needed to be more understanding. He didn't offer to replace it. After that, throwing my things became his pattern. Bad day at work meant my books went in the dumpster. Argument with his brother meant my grandmother's mirror got smashed. Lost at poker night meant my jewelry box went out the window. Each time he'd say I was overreacting, that things didn't matter, that if I really loved him, I'd understand he needed to express his emotions. He'd say real partners accepted each other's flaws. My apartment got emptier and emptier. Friends stopped visiting because there was nowhere to sit. He'd thrown out my couch after his team lost a game. I ate standing at the counter because he'd broken my kitchen table when his ex got engaged. I slept on a mattress on the floor because he'd destroyed the bed frame when he didn't get a promotion. But I still had my mom's pot with the little succulent she'd planted in it sitting on the windowsill. Derek would rage and throw everything else but never touch that pot. Until last Tuesday. Derek came home furious because his presentation had gone badly. His boss, Rick, had criticized his work in front of everyone. Derek started his usual rampage, but everything was already gone. No furniture to flip, no decorations to smash, nothing left to destroy. That's when he saw the pot. I begged him not to touch it, explained again that my dead mother made it, that it was all I had left of her. Derek looked me in the eyes and said possessions were just material chains holding us back from enlightenment. He said I was too attached to objects and he was helping me grow spiritually. Then he threw it out the window of our 4th-floor apartment. I heard it shatter on the concrete below. Something inside me broke with that pot. While Derek lectured about Buddhist philosophy he'd learned from a podcast, I went completely calm. I nodded and said he was right, that I needed to let go of attachments. He smiled and said he knew I'd understand eventually. That night while Derek slept, I started my plan. I knew Derek's office was his pride and joy. He had awards on the walls, an expensive ergonomic chair, signed sports memorabilia, a collection of first-edition business books, and this custom desk he'd inherited from his grandfather. He'd spend weekends there organizing and reorganizing, making sure everything was perfect for when clients visited. The next morning, Derek left for his big client meeting. I called in sick to work and went to his office with a box of trash bags. First went his awards, every single certificate and plaque, straight into the dumpster behind the building. Then his signed jerseys, his vintage baseball cards, his first edition books, all of it. His grandfather's desk was too heavy to move, so I covered it in honey and coffee grounds. I took his ergonomic chair and donated it to the homeless shelter, getting a receipt for tax purposes. I found his collection of client gifts, the expensive whiskey, the golf clubs, the smartwatches, and distributed them to everyone else on his floor with a note saying Derek wanted to show appreciation for the team. His coworker Janet got the watch, his rival Blake got the golf clubs. But I saved the best for last. I found Derek's locked office cabinet behind his grandfather's desk and used the key he kept taped under the bottom drawer because he thought nobody knew about it. Inside sat his most prized possessions arranged like museum pieces on black velvet. The vintage Rolex his grandfather wore during World War II gleamed under the fluorescent lights, still keeping perfect time after 70 years. Next to it sat Derek's college championship ring from when his basketball team won state, the gold band engraved with his name and the year. The signed baseball from some famous player I didn't recognize rested in a clear protective case, the signature still dark and perfect across the white leather. I pulled out my phone and took photos of everything exactly as Derek had arranged it, documenting the pristine condition of each item. Then I started destroying them one by one, the same way Derek had destroyed my things over the past 2 years. The watch went first. I smashed it against the corner of his desk until the crystal face shattered and the tiny gears scattered across the floor like metal confetti. I took a photo of the broken pieces. The championship ring was harder. I tried hitting it with Derek's desk lamp, but the gold just dented, so I used his letter opener to scratch deep gouges across the surface until his name was unreadable. Photo. The baseball I saved for special treatment. I found Derek's expensive fountain pen and drew all over the signature, then tore the leather covering into strips and scattered them in his trash can. Photo. Each destroyed item felt like reclaiming a piece of myself that Derek had taken. My hands stopped shaking as I worked through his cabinet, finding more treasures to ruin. A signed first edition book from his favorite author got its pages ripped out and mixed with the coffee grounds on his desk. His collection of rare coins went down the garbage disposal in the office break room. The framed photo of him with some celebrity got smashed and left in pieces on his chair. I documented everything with photos, creating a record of my revenge that matched the years of destruction Derek had inflicted on me. When I finished, Derek's office looked like a tornado had torn through it. The honey-covered desk attracted flies already buzzing near the windows. His awards were gone from the walls, leaving rectangular shadows on the paint. His chair was missing, donated to people who actually needed it. His prized possessions lay in pieces across the floor, broken beyond any hope of repair. I took one final photo of the destroyed office, then walked out and locked the door behind me, leaving the key in the lock so Derek would know I'd been there. I drove to Veronica's house across town with my hands gripping the steering wheel so tight my knuckles turned white. The adrenaline from destroying Derek's office was wearing off, and reality started creeping in about what I'd just done. Veronica lived in a small house with a bright blue door and flowers in the front yard, the kind of normal, peaceful home I hadn't experienced in years. I sat in my car for a minute trying to compose myself, but when Veronica opened her front door and saw my face, she rushed down the steps and pulled me out of the car. She wrapped her arms around me and I finally broke down completely, crying so hard I couldn't breathe. All the tears I'd held back while destroying Derek's office came pouring out on Veronica's front lawn. I sobbed about the pot, about my mom, about the 2 years I'd wasted with someone who treated my entire life like garbage he could throw away whenever he felt angry. Veronica just held me and let me cry, not asking questions or telling me to calm down, just being there while I fell apart. Eventually, she guided me inside and sat me down on her couch, bringing me water and tissues while I tried to explain everything between gasping breaths. I told her about Derek throwing the pot out the window, about his lecture on Buddhist philosophy and letting go of attachments, about how something inside me just snapped. I told her about going to his office and destroying everything he valued, about the systematic way I'd documented each broken possession just like he'd broken mine. Veronica listened to all of it without judgment, her face getting angrier as I described the years of Derek's destruction. Veronica made me tea I didn't drink and sat beside me while I shook with leftover adrenaline and grief. She grabbed a notebook and pen from her kitchen drawer and started making a list of everything I needed to do next. Document the apartment damage with photos. Contact the building manager about Derek's destruction. Gather my important documents before Derek could destroy or hide them. Find somewhere safe to stay because Derek would definitely come looking for me. Prepare for his reaction when he discovered what I'd done to his office. The list kept growing as Veronica thought of more practical steps, her handwriting neat and organized while my brain felt like scattered pieces I couldn't put back together. She asked if I had copies of my birth certificate, social security card, passport, and I realized I wasn't sure where Derek had put them after our last move. Veronica added that to the list with 3 stars next to it. She asked about my bank accounts and whether Derek had access to them, and I admitted we had a joint account he insisted we needed for household expenses. Another item on the list with stars. She asked if I had photos of all the things Derek had destroyed over the years, and I pulled out my phone to show her the album I'd been keeping without really understanding why. Hundreds of photos of broken belongings, shattered glass, empty spaces where furniture used to be, all documented like evidence I didn't know I was collecting. I called the building manager Delilah from Veronica's couch, my voice still shaky from crying. Delilah answered on the second ring, and I explained that I needed to report property damage at my apartment, that my boyfriend had thrown something out the 4th floor window. She asked if anyone was hurt, and I said no, just a ceramic pot that shattered on the concrete below. I texted her the photos I'd taken of the broken pieces, the sunflowers my mom had painted barely visible on the largest shard. Delilah was quiet for a moment looking at the photos, then asked how long this kind of thing had been going on. I told her 2 years, and she said other tenants had complained about loud crashes and breaking sounds from our unit over the past year, that she'd been documenting the noise complaints in case she needed to take action. She said she'd add my report to the file and asked if I could meet her at the apartment in an hour, so she could document the damage inside. I agreed, even though the thought of going back there made my stomach hurt. Delilah mentioned she'd need to involve the landlord given the extent of the property damage, and I said I understood. She asked if I felt safe going back to the apartment, and I told her my sister would come with me. Delilah said that was smart and she'd see me in an hour. Delilah met us at the apartment building exactly on time, carrying a tablet and camera for documenting everything. She took photos of the shattered pot pieces still on the concrete, measuring the distance from our 4th floor window and noting the trajectory. Inside the apartment, she walked through each room slowly, photographing the empty spaces where furniture should be. She documented the missing couch, the broken kitchen table still in pieces in the corner, the mattress on the floor without a bed frame. She spent extra time photographing Derek's grandfather's desk covered in dried honey and coffee grounds, asking when that damage occurred. I explained it was months ago during one of Derek's rages, and I'd been too scared to clean it up or mention it. Delilah made notes on her tablet about each damaged or missing item, creating an official record of the destruction. She measured the scratches on the walls where Derek had thrown things, photographed the holes punched in the drywall, documented the broken window lock from when Derek had smashed it during an argument. She asked careful questions about each piece of damage, and I answered as honestly as I could, watching her face get more serious with each room we entered. When we finished the walkthrough, Delilah sat down on the floor since there was nowhere else to sit, and explained that this level of property damage violated our lease agreement. She'd need to involve the landlord, and there would likely be charges for repairs. I told her Derek was responsible for all the destruction, not me, and she said she believed me based on the pattern of damage and the other tenants' complaints. She seemed genuinely sympathetic as she explained the next steps. Veronica and I went back to the apartment after Delilah left, knowing we had maybe 2 hours before Derek's client meeting ended. I needed to grab my essential documents, clothes, and anything else Derek hadn't destroyed yet. We moved quickly through the empty rooms, Veronica holding trash bags while I threw in whatever I could find. My birth certificate was in a file box under the bathroom sink where Derek had shoved it months ago. My passport was in his desk drawer mixed with his own papers. My social security card took 15 minutes to locate, finally turning up in a kitchen cabinet behind some dishes. I packed clothes from the closet, realizing Derek had thrown out most of my nice things over the past year, and I was left with mostly old t-shirts and jeans. My laptop was still on the floor where I'd left it that morning, and I grabbed the charger and shoved both in a bag. A few books Derek had missed, some photos from before we moved in together, my mom's pottery class registration form that had been tucked in a drawer. Everything that mattered fit in 2 bags, and I realized how little I had left. Veronica kept checking her phone for the time, reminding me we needed to hurry. I was scared Derek would come home early and catch us there, scared of what he'd do if he found me packing to leave. Every sound from the hallway made me jump. My hands wouldn't stop shaking as I moved through the apartment gathering my things. I kept pausing at the empty windowsill where my mom's pot used to sit, staring at the bare space like I could make it reappear through force of will. Veronica found me frozen there for the 3rd time, my hand reaching toward nothing. She put her arm around my shoulders and gently turned me away from the window, reminding me we needed to finish packing before Derek returned. She said staying focused on practical tasks would help me get through this, that I could grieve later when I was somewhere safe. I nodded and forced myself to keep moving, checking drawers and closets for anything I'd missed. Veronica was right that action helped, that having concrete tasks kept the panic at bay. I found my old jewelry box in the back of the closet, the one Derek had thrown out the window during poker night. Someone must have brought it back up and I'd shoved it away without looking inside. It was empty except for one cheap necklace my mom had given me for my 16th birthday, the chain broken but the pendant intact. I put it in my pocket and kept searching. Every few minutes, Veronica would check the time and remind me how long we had left. 45 minutes, 30 minutes, 20 minutes before Derek's meeting should end. We loaded everything into Veronica's car in 3 trips, working fast and quiet. First trip was clothes and documents, the essentials I absolutely needed. Second trip was my laptop and the few books Derek hadn't destroyed. Third trip was random items I'd found, things that had survived 2 years of Derek's anger through luck or oversight. Standing next to Veronica's car, I looked at my entire life packed into her trunk and back seat. 2 suitcases of clothes, 1 box of documents, my laptop in its bag, a small box of photos and mementos. That was everything. 2 years of living with Derek had reduced me to less than what I'd owned in college, back when I was 22 and just starting out. Derek had systematically destroyed everything that mattered to me until I was left with almost nothing, and seeing it all fit so easily in Veronica's car made me want to cry again. All the furniture I'd bought for our apartment, gone. My book collection from college, gone. The plants I'd grown from seeds, the decorations I'd chosen, my grandmother's mirror, all of it destroyed because Derek couldn't control his anger. Veronica closed the trunk and gave me a hug, not saying anything because there was nothing to say that would make this better. We got in the car and drove away from the apartment, and I didn't look back. Back at Veronica's house, I finally checked my phone and saw 7 missed calls from Derek. My stomach dropped and my hands started shaking again as I realized what that meant. Derek's client meeting should still be going. He shouldn't be calling me at all, which meant he must have left early or canceled it. He must have gone back to his office and discovered what I'd done. He knew about the destroyed possessions, the donated items, the honey-covered desk, all of it. He knew I'd fought back in the only way that would actually hurt him, that I'd taken his most prized possessions and broken them just like he'd broken mine. The missed calls had started 45 minutes ago, right around when we'd been loading my things into Veronica's car. If Derek had gone to the apartment looking for me, we just barely missed him. I showed Veronica my phone and she immediately said we needed to listen to the voicemails, that we needed to know what Derek's reaction was. I didn't want to hear his voice, but I knew she was right. I put the phone on speaker and pressed play on the first voicemail. The voicemail started apologetic. Derek's voice calm and reasonable, like he was talking to a child who'd misbehaved. He said he understood why I was upset about the pot, that he realized he'd gone too far this time. He said we should talk about it like adults, that we could work through this together if I'd just come home. The second voicemail was similar, Derek explaining that he'd been stressed about work and hadn't been thinking clearly. He said he loved me and wanted to fix things between us. But the third voicemail was different. His voice had an edge to it, tight and controlled. He said he'd gone to his office and seen what I'd done, that he couldn't believe I'd destroyed his grandfather's watch and his championship ring. The fourth voicemail was pure rage, Derek screaming so loud the phone speaker distorted. He called me crazy and vindictive, said I was a psycho who destroyed thousands of dollars worth of his property. He said his coworkers had seen everything, that I'd humiliated him in front of the entire office. The fifth voicemail threatened legal action, Derek saying he was calling the police to report theft and destruction of property, that I'd be arrested for what I'd done. The sixth voicemail was more screaming, Derek calling me names and saying I'd regret this. The seventh voicemail was the worst, Derek's voice cold and quiet, promising he'd find me and make me pay for every single thing I'd broken. Veronica and I sat in silence after the last voicemail ended, the threats hanging in the air between us. Veronica grabbed my hand and pulled me toward the kitchen where we could talk without my phone speaker echoing through her whole house. She opened her laptop and started typing notes while I replayed the voicemails one more time, her face getting harder with each message Derek left. When the last one finished, she looked at me and said we needed to call the police right now, before Derek had time to spin this into some story where I was the crazy one who destroyed his stuff for no reason. I started to argue that maybe we should wait, that maybe Derek would calm down, but Veronica cut me off and reminded me that Derek had spent 2 years destroying everything I owned, and now he was threatening me. She pulled up photos on my phone from 6 months ago when our apartment still had furniture, then photos from 3 months ago when it was half empty, then photos from last week when it was basically bare except for that mattress on the floor. Delilah's documentation from this morning showed the honey-covered desk and the empty windowsill where my mom's pot used to sit, and Veronica said this was evidence of a pattern, proof that Derek was the abuser, and I was the victim who finally fought back. She called the non-emergency police line while I sat there shaking, trying to figure out if I was about to get arrested for what I did to Derek's office. The dispatcher said an officer would come to take my report within the hour, and Veronica made me tea and sat with me on her couch while we waited. I kept checking my phone expecting more calls from Derek, but it stayed silent, and somehow that was worse than the screaming voicemails. The officer who showed up was older, maybe 50, with gray hair and tired eyes like he'd seen everything. He introduced himself and sat down at Veronica's kitchen table with a notebook, asking me to start from the beginning and tell him everything. I showed him the photos first, the progression of our apartment getting emptier and emptier as Derek destroyed my belongings over 2 years. The officer looked through each photo carefully, asking questions about dates and what Derek had said during each incident, writing everything down in his notebook. When I got to the part about my mom's pot, my voice cracked and I had to stop talking for a minute. The officer waited patiently until I could continue, then asked me to play Derek's voicemails for him. He listened to all 7 messages without interrupting, his expression getting more serious as Derek's threats escalated. When the last voicemail ended, the officer looked at me and said that Derek's behavior constituted domestic violence, even though he never hit me. Property destruction used to control and scare a partner was abuse, and Derek's voicemails contained clear threats that made this a criminal matter. He asked if I wanted to pursue a restraining order, explaining that it would legally prevent Derek from contacting me or coming near me. I nodded and said yes, and the officer started filling out paperwork right there at Veronica's kitchen table. Then I took a deep breath and told the officer what I did to Derek's office, explaining about the destroyed awards and donated items and the grandfather's watch I smashed with a hammer. I expected him to stop writing and tell me I was under arrest, that I'd committed a crime just like Derek had. But the officer just kept taking notes and asked me questions about what I destroyed and whether I had photos or receipts for anything. He explained that mutual property destruction in domestic situations was complicated legally, that prosecutors usually didn't want to charge both parties when there was a clear pattern of abuse from one person. Derek had spent 2 years systematically destroying my belongings to control me, and I had 1 episode of retaliation after he destroyed the last thing I had from my dead mother. The officer said I should document everything I destroyed with photos and receipts, and maybe talk to a lawyer about civil court, but he didn't think criminal charges were likely given Derek's established pattern of abuse. He finished the restraining order paperwork and said a judge would review it tomorrow, and in the meantime I should stay somewhere Derek didn't know about and not respond to any contact from him. Veronica assured him I was staying with her, and the officer left his card and told me to call immediately if Derek showed up or tried to contact me again. After the officer left, Veronica made us both dinner, and we tried to watch TV to distract ourselves from constantly checking my phone. Her husband got home from work around 6, and Veronica filled him in on everything, and he immediately said I should stay with them as long as I needed. Their spare bedroom was mine. No questions asked. No pressure to figure everything out right now. I started crying again because I'd been so isolated in Derek's world where everything was my fault, and I was too sensitive and I needed to understand his anger. Veronica and her husband were just being kind without conditions, offering help without making me feel like I owed them something or needed to earn their support. I'd forgotten what normal relationships looked like, forgotten that people could care about each other without keeping score of every favor. Veronica's husband ordered pizza, and we ate together at their actual dining table with actual chairs, and the simple normalcy of sitting down to eat a meal made me realize how broken my life with Derek had become. Around 8 that evening, someone started pounding on Veronica's front door hard enough to rattle the frame. My whole body went cold because I knew immediately it was Derek, knew he'd somehow figured out where I was. Veronica grabbed her phone and dialed the police while her husband went to the door but didn't open it. Derek was yelling from outside, demanding that I come talk to him like an adult, saying we needed to work this out face to face. I ran to Veronica's bedroom and locked myself in, my hands shaking so badly I could barely turn the lock. I could hear Derek through the walls, his voice getting louder and angrier, calling me a coward for hiding and saying I couldn't avoid him forever. Veronica's husband told Derek through the closed door that he needed to leave the property immediately, or the police were coming, but Derek just kept yelling. He said I'd destroyed thousands of dollars of his property and humiliated him at work, and I owed him an explanation and compensation. His voice had that tight, controlled rage from the voicemails, like he was barely holding himself back from breaking something. I sat on the floor of Veronica's bedroom with my back against the door, listening to Derek yell threats on the front lawn and waiting for the police to arrive. The police car pulled up maybe 10 minutes later, though it felt like hours of listening to Derek rage outside. I heard the officer's voice through the window asking Derek to step away from the house, and Derek's tone immediately changed to calm and reasonable. He explained that I was his girlfriend and we'd had a fight, that he just wanted to talk to me and work things out. The officer asked Derek his name, and there was a pause before the officer said he recognized that name from an earlier report today. The officer's voice got firmer, telling Derek that I'd already made it clear I didn't want contact with him, and he needed to leave immediately. Derek started arguing that he had a right to talk to his girlfriend, that this was between us and the police shouldn't be involved. The officer cut him off and said that I'd filed for a restraining order, and Derek continuing to contact me could result in arrest. He told Derek to leave the property now and not come back, not to call me, not to go to my work, not to contact me in any way. Derek's voice got louder again, saying this was ridiculous and I was being dramatic, but the officer warned him that if he didn't leave right now, he'd be arrested for trespassing and harassment. I heard Derek's footsteps finally walking away, heard his car door slam and his engine start. Veronica came to get me from the bedroom once Derek was gone, and the officer came inside to file a report about the incident and add it to my restraining order application. After the officer left and we were sure Derek was really gone, I sat on Veronica's couch and just shook for a while. Veronica's husband brought me a blanket and more tea, and they both sat with me without trying to make me talk about it. Eventually, Veronica's husband said again that I could stay as long as I needed, that their home was my home and I was safe here. Their kindness broke something open in me, and I cried harder than I had all day, crying for my mom's pot and my empty apartment, and the 2 years I spent managing Derek's anger. I cried because I'd forgotten that people could just be nice without wanting something, that relationships didn't have to involve walking on eggshells and accepting destruction as normal. Veronica held me while I cried and told me I was going to be okay, that leaving Derek was the hardest part and everything else would get easier. I wanted to believe her, but all I could think about was Derek's face when he threw my mom's pot out the window and the cold satisfaction I'd felt smashing his grandfather's watch with a hammer. That night I couldn't sleep even though I was exhausted. I lay in Veronica's spare bedroom staring at the ceiling, replaying everything that happened. I kept seeing Derek's expression when he said possessions were material chains, right before he threw the only thing I had left of my mom out a 4th floor window. I kept feeling the weight of the hammer in my hand as I brought it down on his grandfather's watch, the glass face shattering under the impact. Part of me felt justified, felt like Derek deserved to lose his prized possessions the same way he'd made me lose mine. But another part of me wondered if destroying his things made me just as bad as him, if I'd crossed some line that meant I couldn't claim moral high ground anymore. My therapist would probably say they weren't equivalent, that his destruction was about control and mine was about breaking free. But lying there in the dark, I wasn't sure if that distinction mattered, or if violence was violence regardless of motivation. The moral uncertainty kept me awake until I saw light starting to come through the curtains, and I finally gave up on sleeping and went to make coffee in Veronica's kitchen. My phone rang around 9 the next morning, and I almost didn't answer because I thought it might be Derek calling from a different number. But the caller ID showed Jacqueline from work, my best friend who I'd barely talked to in months because Derek always had some reason why I couldn't meet her for lunch or go to her parties. I answered, and Jacqueline immediately asked if I was okay, said Derek had called her last night trying to find out where I was. She told him she didn't know and wouldn't tell him even if she did. And then she called me as soon as she thought I might be awake. Jacqueline said she never liked Derek, that she'd noticed how I changed after we moved in together. I used to talk about my pottery classes and my book club and weekend plans, but gradually all I talked about was Derek's moods and his work stress and how to avoid making him angry. She said she tried to bring it up a few times, but I always defended him, always had an explanation for why he acted that way. Now that I'd finally left, she wanted me to know she was relieved and proud of me and ready to help however she could. Jacqueline kept talking, mentioning that other people at work had noticed changes in me too. She said I used to be confident and outgoing, but over the past 2 years I became quieter and more anxious. I started checking my phone constantly during lunch like I was afraid of missing Derek's messages, and I stopped participating in after-work activities because I always had to get home. People noticed I stopped wearing certain clothes and stopped talking about my interests, like I was slowly disappearing into Derek's shadow. Jacqueline said several coworkers had asked her if I was okay, if something was wrong at home, but she didn't know what to tell them because I never admitted anything was wrong. Hearing that my isolation was visible to other people made something click in my head. I'd thought I was hiding it, thought I was managing Derek's abuse privately, but apparently everyone around me could see me shrinking. Derek's control over my life had been so complete that I couldn't even recognize it, and that realization made me feel sick. I thanked Jacqueline for calling and promised to meet her for lunch soon, then hung up and sat there processing the fact that my abuse had been obvious to everyone except me. The landlord called around noon while I was still at Veronica's house trying to figure out my next steps. He said he needed to discuss the lease situation, that the building manager had documented severe property damage in our unit. The lease agreement specifically prohibited destruction of property, and he was starting eviction proceedings against both me and Derek. I took a deep breath and explained that I'd already moved out, that I wasn't living there anymore and had no intention of going back. I told him Derek was responsible for all the destruction, that he'd spent 2 years systematically destroying my belongings and the apartment. The landlord was quiet for a minute, then asked if I had documentation of that. I told him about Delilah's photos and reports, about the other tenants who'd complained about noise, about the police report I'd filed yesterday. The landlord said if I could provide all that documentation, he'd remove me from the eviction and pursue damages against Derek specifically. He'd need me to come sign some paperwork and provide copies of everything, but he believed me and wanted to make sure I wasn't held responsible for Derek's destruction. I agreed to come by his office later that week, then hung up feeling like maybe things were starting to move in the right direction. My phone buzzed around 2 in the afternoon and I saw Derek's name on the screen. The text started with how sorry he was about the pot, how he understood why I was upset, how he never meant to hurt me that badly. Then it switched to talking about his office, describing how his coworkers walked past his honey-covered desk and whispered about him. He said Janet wore the watch I'd given her right in front of him during a meeting. He said Blake used the golf clubs at the company tournament and everyone knew they'd been Derek's. The text went on for paragraphs, bouncing between apologizing and blaming me, between saying he loved me and calling me vindictive. I read the whole thing twice and felt my hands shaking with anger, not at what he'd done to his office, but at myself for falling for his manipulation for so long. Every word was calculated to make me feel guilty, to make me think I'd gone too far, to pull me back into his control. I didn't respond. I turned my phone face down on Veronica's coffee table and walked away from it. Veronica found me in her guest room an hour later staring at the wall. She sat down next to me and asked if I was okay. I told her about Derek's text and she immediately pulled out her laptop. She typed something and turned the screen toward me, showing search results for therapists who worked with domestic violence survivors. I started to say that Derek never hit me, that it wasn't really domestic violence, but Veronica cut me off. She explained that abuse wasn't just physical, that what Derek did had a name. She read from one of the websites about intimate partner violence, about how it was included property destruction, isolation, and psychological control. She showed me articles describing exactly what Derek had done to me over 2 years, written in clinical terms by professionals who studied this stuff. Seeing our relationship described that way, seeing patterns I thought were unique to us listed as common abuse tactics, made something shift in my head. I wasn't crazy. I wasn't too sensitive. Derek had been abusing me, and I just hadn't known the right words for it. Veronica helped me make appointments with 3 different therapists the next morning. The first one had an opening that afternoon, and I took it even though my stomach twisted with nervousness about talking to a stranger. The therapist's office was small and calm, with plants on the windowsill that reminded me of my mom's succulent. I sat on her couch and told her about the pot, about Derek's years of destruction, about my revenge on his office. She listened without interrupting and took notes on a yellow pad. When I finished, she set down her pen and explained that abusers often target their partner's most meaningful possessions, specifically to cause maximum emotional harm. Derek destroying my mom's pot wasn't random anger or bad timing. It was a calculated attack on the one thing he knew I valued most, designed to break me down completely and make me believe I deserved his treatment. She said the fact that he'd avoided the pot for 2 years, and then destroyed it during his worst rage, proved he always knew exactly what he was doing. I asked the therapist if destroying Derek's office made me just as bad as him. She leaned forward and said my revenge wasn't the same as Derek's abuse because his destruction was about control, and mine was about breaking free. She explained that victims sometimes fight back in ways that seem violent or extreme, that hitting your breaking point and retaliating once didn't make me an abuser. She said Derek spent 2 years training me to accept his behavior, to minimize my own needs, to believe his anger was justified. What I did to his office was me finally saying no, finally pushing back, finally refusing to accept what he'd done. She called it a survival response, not abuse. I cried in her office for 20 minutes after that. Not sad tears, but relieved ones, because someone finally told me I wasn't a terrible person for what I'd done. My phone rang while I was driving back to Veronica's house, and I almost didn't answer when I saw an unknown number. But something made me pick up, and a man's voice asked if I was Derek's girlfriend. I said I used to be and asked who was calling. He introduced himself as Javier Castro, Derek's boss, and said Derek had listed me as his emergency contact. My heart jumped because I thought something bad had happened to Derek, but Javier quickly said Derek was fine physically. He said he was calling because he was concerned about Derek's recent behavior at work. Derek had been erratic, missing meetings, snapping at coworkers, and then there was the incident with his office. Javier carefully asked if there were personal issues he should know about regarding Derek's stability and judgment. I pulled over into a parking lot because my hands started shaking. I told Javier a version of the truth that felt safe to share with Derek's boss. I said Derek and I had broken up, that he had anger management issues, and that I wasn't comfortable being his emergency contact anymore. I didn't mention the pot or my revenge or the years of abuse. Javier was quiet for a second and then thanked me for my honesty. He said Derek's behavior and the office incident had raised concerns with the management team. He said he appreciated me being straightforward about the situation, and he'd make sure to update Derek's emergency contact information. After we hung up, I sat in my car processing the fact that Derek's professional life was falling apart too. Part of me felt guilty, and part of me felt satisfied, and I didn't know which feeling was right. Ruth called that evening while I was helping Veronica make dinner. She said Veronica had told her what happened, and she wanted me to know I could stay with her for as long as I needed. She had a spare bedroom with its own bathroom, and she lived alone, so I'd have plenty of space and privacy. Ruth said she never liked how Derek isolated me from family gatherings, how he always had an excuse for why we couldn't visit for holidays or birthdays. She said she'd tried to bring it up to me once, but I'd defended him, and she didn't want to push. Now that I'd finally gotten away from him, she wanted to help however she could. I thanked her and promised to think about her offer, but I was already planning to take her up on it because Veronica had 2 kids and limited space. 3 days later, Derek showed up at my workplace. I was walking to my car after my shift when I saw him leaning against my driver's side door. My whole body went cold and I stopped walking, but he'd already seen me. He pushed off the car and started toward me, saying we needed to talk about our property situation. I told him to leave me alone and kept walking toward the building entrance where there were security cameras. Derek followed me, his voice getting louder as he demanded I pay for his destroyed office items. He listed everything I'd ruined with dollar amounts attached. His grandfather's watch worth $3,000, the signed baseball worth $5,000, the business books worth hundreds each. He grabbed my arm when I tried to walk past him and I jerked away, my heart pounding so hard I felt dizzy. A coworker saw what was happening and yelled asking if I was okay. Derek let go and backed up but kept talking about the money I owed him. Security came out and made him leave the parking lot, but I was shaking so badly I couldn't drive home for 30 minutes. I filed for a restraining order the next morning with help from a lawyer Veronica found for me. The lawyer said Derek showing up at my work and grabbing my arm was harassment and assault, and combined with his pattern of abuse and property destruction, I had a strong case. We filled out forms describing everything Derek had done, attaching Delilah's photos of the apartment damage and copies of the police report from when I documented his destruction. The court set a hearing date for 2 weeks out and served Derek with a temporary order telling him to stay away from me. My lawyer explained that the hearing would require me to testify about Derek's behavior, but she was confident the judge would grant a permanent order based on the evidence. The hearing happened on a Wednesday morning in a small courtroom that smelled like old wood and floor cleaner. I sat at a table with my lawyer while Derek sat across the aisle with his own lawyer, a woman in an expensive suit who looked annoyed to be there. The judge called my case and I had to walk to the witness stand and swear to tell the truth. My lawyer asked me questions about Derek's pattern of destruction, and I answered them, describing the 2 years of him systematically destroying my belongings. Derek's lawyer cross-examined me, trying to make me admit that I'd destroyed Derek's office in an equally violent way. She showed photos of his honey-covered desk and his missing awards, suggesting I was just as abusive as I claimed Derek was. But my lawyer objected and showed the judge Delilah's documentation of our empty apartment, the police reports from neighbors about noise complaints, and photos of all my destroyed belongings spanning 2 years. The judge looked at everything for a long time, and then granted a temporary restraining order for 6 months. She said there was a clear pattern of escalating abuse, and Derek needed to stay at least 500 feet away from me at all times. 2 days after the hearing, I started getting emails from an address I didn't recognize. The emails said things like Derek just wanted to talk, that he was sorry, that he was going to therapy now and wanted to make things right. I knew immediately it was Derek using a fake account to get around the restraining order. I forwarded everything to my lawyer and she told me to report it to the police. I drove to the police station that afternoon and showed the officer the emails. He looked up Derek's information and said he'd contact Derek with a warning about violating the restraining order. My lawyer called me later and explained that these documented violations actually helped my case, because they proved Derek couldn't follow court orders. She said if Derek kept trying to contact me, the judge would likely extend the restraining order and Derek could face criminal charges for continued harassment. The emails stopped after the police warning, and I spent the next week looking at apartment listings on my phone during lunch breaks. Veronica helped me narrow down options, and we scheduled viewings for 3 places that allowed month-to-month leases, in case I needed to move again quickly. The first apartment smelled like cigarettes and had stains on the carpet that made me not want to touch anything. The second place was nice, but the landlord kept asking personal questions about why I was moving alone and whether I had a boyfriend, which made my skin crawl. The third apartment was a small studio on the second floor of an older building, plain and simple with white walls and basic appliances, but the landlord was a woman in her 60s who just asked for references and first month's rent. I signed the lease that afternoon and gave her Veronica's number as my emergency contact, since I couldn't use Derek anymore. Moving day happened fast because I barely owned anything after years of Derek's destruction. Veronica drove me to the apartment with my 2 suitcases and box of documents, and we made a list of everything I needed to buy to make the place livable. The list got longer and longer as we walked through the empty studio, realizing I didn't have sheets or towels or dishes or a trash can or cleaning supplies or any of the basic things people need. We drove to the big box store across town, and I pushed a cart through the aisles, putting in cheap plates and silverware and a set of towels. Veronica grabbed a coffee maker and put it in the cart, and I started crying right there in the housewares section, because I'd forgotten I needed one, and Derek had broken mine over a year ago. She hugged me while other shoppers walked past, and I felt stupid for crying over a coffee maker, but also couldn't stop. We spent 3 hours shopping and over $800 on basics, and when we loaded everything into Veronica's car, I realized this was more stuff than I'd owned in the past year combined. Back at my new apartment, we unpacked boxes and put away dishes, and Veronica helped me make the bed with the new sheets I'd bought. The apartment looked empty, even with furniture, because the walls were bare and there was no decoration, just functional items arranged in their proper places. Before Veronica left, she made me promise to text her every day and call if Derek tried anything, and she wrote her address on a piece of paper and taped it to my fridge in case I forgot in an emergency. That night, I slept in my own apartment for the first time in years, in a bed Derek didn't know about in a building he'd never been to, and I kept waking up thinking I heard him coming through the door. The next morning, I went to the garden center near my apartment and bought a small succulent plant in a plain terracotta pot. It wasn't my mom's pot and never would be, but I put it on the windowsill in the kitchen where sunlight came through in the mornings. Taking care of something living felt important, like proving to myself that I could maintain something without it being destroyed. I watered the succulent and made coffee in my new coffee maker, and the apartment was quiet in a way that felt peaceful instead of empty. 3 weeks after I moved in, a thick envelope arrived at my apartment with a return address from a law office I didn't recognize. Inside was a demand letter from Derek's lawyer claiming I owed him $8,000 for destroyed office property, with itemized receipts attached. The list included his grandfather's desk valued at $3,000, his awards and certificates at $500 total, his signed sports memorabilia at $2,000, his business books at $800, and various other items adding up to the total. The letter demanded payment within 30 days, or Derek would pursue legal action in civil court. I called my lawyer immediately and read her the letter over the phone, and she told me to scan and email everything so she could respond. She called me back 2 hours later and said she was drafting a response with documentation of everything Derek had destroyed over 2 years, which totaled over $30,000 based on replacement costs. My lawyer explained that Derek's case was weak because his destruction was part of an established pattern of abuse, while my retaliation was a single incident after years of provocation. She said most judges would see the context, and Derek's lawyer probably knew this, so they might drop it once they saw our documentation. Her response letter went out the next day with photos Delilah had taken of our destroyed apartment, receipts I'd saved for some of my belongings, and estimates for replacing my grandmother's mirror, my laptop, my furniture, and everything else Derek had thrown away or broken. We never heard back from Derek's lawyer after that, and my lawyer said they'd likely advise Derek that pursuing this would expose him to a much larger counterclaim he couldn't win. I started hearing things through mutual friends about what Derek was telling people. Someone from our old friend group called to ask if I was okay, because Derek had told them I'd had a mental breakdown and destroyed his office for no reason. Another friend messaged asking what really happened because Derek's story didn't make sense given what they knew about him. I realized Derek was spinning a version where he was the victim of a crazy ex-girlfriend who snapped and ruined his professional life out of nowhere. Some people believed him because they only knew Derek's side, and I watched as mutual friends stopped liking my social media posts or responding to my messages. Losing those friendships hurt more than I expected because I'd known some of these people for years, but Jacqueline pointed out something important when I told her about it. She said anyone who heard Derek's story and didn't bother asking my side or remembering his past behavior wasn't really my friend anyway. Real friends would have questions, would want to hear both sides, would remember the times I'd canceled plans, or seemed stressed around Derek. The people who immediately believed Derek's victim story were either his friends first, or didn't care enough about me to think critically. Jacqueline reminded me that she'd tried to talk to me about Derek's behavior twice before I left, and I'd defended him both times because I was so deep in his manipulation I couldn't see it clearly. She said losing fair-weather friends were part of the process of rebuilding my life with people who actually cared about me. The landlord's lawsuit against Derek moved forward through the court system over the next 2 months. Delilah called to let me know she'd been subpoenaed to provide testimony and documentation about the apartment damage, and she asked if I was okay with her sharing everything she'd photographed. I told her to share whatever helped establish the truth about what happened. Derek tried to claim in his court filings that I was equally responsible for the property damage, but Delilah's documentation clearly showed years of noise complaints from other tenants about crashing sounds and breaking glass coming from our unit. The complaints dated back almost to when we moved in, and they described specific incidents of loud banging and items being thrown. Other tenants provided statements saying they'd heard Derek yelling and things breaking, and one neighbor said they'd almost called the police multiple times but didn't want to get involved. The landlord's lawyer used all this evidence to establish that Derek was the source of the destruction, and my name got removed from the lawsuit entirely. Delilah told me later that the judge had ruled in the landlord's favor for over $12,000 in damages, and Derek would have to pay for repairs to the apartment, replacement of damaged fixtures, and lost rent during the repair period. I felt vindicated knowing there was a legal record of what Derek had done, even if I'd never see that money myself. Therapy sessions helped me work through the complicated feelings about what I'd done to Derek's office. My therapist asked if I regretted destroying his things, and I said no, which surprised me when I heard myself say it out loud. She explained that regret and healing aren't the same thing, and I could acknowledge that my revenge was justified while still processing the anger and grief that drove me to that point. We talked about how Derek's destruction was about control and intimidation, meant to break me down and make me accept his behavior. My revenge was about breaking free and showing him that his actions had consequences, which was fundamentally different even if the surface action looked similar. My therapist said healing wasn't about forgiving Derek or feeling bad about fighting back. It was about understanding what happened to me and learning to trust my own judgment again. She pointed out that I'd spent 2 years doubting myself, because Derek told me I was too sensitive and too materialistic, and rebuilding my confidence meant recognizing that my feelings and needs were valid all along. We worked on identifying the patterns of manipulation Derek used, like how he'd apologize after destroying something but then do it again, or how he'd frame his anger as justified, and my hurt as overreaction. Understanding these patterns helped me see how thoroughly he'd messed with my perception of reality. I started reconnecting with friends I'd lost touch with during my relationship with Derek, people I'd stopped calling or seeing because managing Derek's moods took all my energy. My college roommate came over to see my new apartment and brought wine, and we talked for hours about everything that had happened. She admitted that she and other friends had tried to express concerns about Derek early on, but I'd always defended him and explained away his behavior. She said they'd backed off because they didn't want to push me away, but they'd been worried and hoped I'd eventually see what they saw. Hearing her perspective made me understand how thoroughly Derek had isolated me without me even realizing it. I'd stopped going to game nights because Derek would get upset if I stayed out late. I'd declined invitations to concerts because Derek said the music was too loud and gave him headaches. I'd skipped birthday parties because Derek had a bad day and needed me home. Each individual instance seemed reasonable at the time, but added together they created a pattern of isolation that cut me off from my support system. My friend said she was just glad I'd gotten out and that she was here now for whatever I needed. We made plans to have regular dinners, and she introduced me to her new friend group since our old mutual friends had scattered. 3 months after leaving Derek, I was doing better in measurable ways, but still struggled with anxiety that came out of nowhere. I'd be shopping for groceries and suddenly worry that buying the expensive coffee beans was too materialistic and wasteful. I'd see something I wanted for my apartment and hear Derek's voice in my head telling me possessions were just material chains. My therapist called this internalized abuse, explaining that Derek's voice had become part of my internal dialogue after years of hearing his justifications and criticisms. She gave me exercises to challenge those thoughts, asking myself whether I actually believed things didn't matter, or if that was Derek's manipulation still affecting me. I practiced buying things I wanted without guilt, starting small with a nice candle and working up to bigger purchases like a comfortable reading chair. Each time I bought something and brought it home without fear of it being destroyed, I felt a little more like myself again. The anxiety didn't disappear completely, but it got quieter, and I learned to recognize when Derek's voice was talking versus my own actual feelings and needs. I heard through Jacqueline that Derek got fired from his job about a month after the office incident. She'd run into someone who worked at Derek's company, and they said Derek's behavior had become increasingly strange after the office destruction. He'd apparently had an outburst during a meeting, accused coworkers of conspiring against him, and made comments that concerned his boss enough to put him on administrative leave. When he came back from leave, he'd lasted less than a week before another incident led to his termination. Derek sent a series of emails to mutual friends blaming me for his job loss, claiming that my destruction of his office had ruined his professional reputation and made it impossible for him to work effectively. My lawyer advised me to forward the emails to her and document everything but not respond directly. She explained that Derek was trying to provoke a reaction, and that engaging would only give him what he wanted. I saved every email in a folder and tried not to think about Derek's downward spiral, reminding myself that his consequences were results of his own choices and behavior. My therapist reinforced this, explaining that I wasn't responsible for managing or fixing Derek's life anymore, and that his attempts to blame me were another form of refusing to take accountability for his actions. I decided to start a small memorial project for my mom since I couldn't have the pot back. Veronica came over one afternoon with a shadow box frame she'd bought and a bag of craft supplies. We spread everything out on my kitchen table and sorted through photos of my mom I'd saved on my phone and printed at the drugstore. I found the registration form from her pottery class in my box of documents. The paper yellowed and creased, but still readable with my mom's handwriting listing the class dates. Veronica suggested we go back to the old apartment building to see if any pieces of the broken pot were still there, and we drove over together even though I was nervous about seeing the place again. The building looked the same but felt different now that I didn't live there, and we walked around to the side where Derek had thrown the pot out the window. Most of the ceramic pieces were gone, swept up or blown away, but I found one larger shard with part of a painted sunflower still visible on the glazed surface. We brought it back to my apartment and Veronica helped me arrange everything in the shadow box, with photos of my mom in the center, the pottery class registration form on one side, and the broken pot piece carefully positioned at the bottom. We hung the shadow box on the wall in my living room, where I could see it from my bed, and looking at it made me feel connected to my mom again, in a way I hadn't since Derek destroyed the pot. It wasn't the same as having her actual creation, but it was something meaningful I'd made to honor her memory, and Derek couldn't take that away from me. The restraining order hearing 3 weeks later felt different from the temporary one. Derek sat across the courtroom with his lawyer, and I could see him trying to look calm and reasonable, but his leg bounced under the table and his jaw clenched every time the judge looked at documentation. My lawyer presented the police reports from Derek's violations, the emails he'd sent through fake accounts, the messages he'd passed through mutual friends asking me to drop the order. The judge reviewed everything slowly, flipping through pages while Derek's lawyer tried to argue that his client had learned from therapy and deserved another chance. But then the judge looked up and said Derek's behavior showed no real understanding of what he'd done wrong, that his continued attempts to contact me proved he didn't respect boundaries or legal orders. The restraining order became permanent, effective for 3 years with possibility of extension if Derek violated it again. Derek's face went red and he started to stand up, but his lawyer grabbed his arm and pulled him back down. Walking out of that courtroom knowing Derek legally couldn't come near me for 3 years made my shoulders drop with relief I didn't know I'd been holding. Jacqueline mentioned a support group at the community center that met Tuesday evenings, and I went mostly because she offered to come with me the first time. We sat in a circle of folding chairs in a room that smelled like coffee and cleaning products, and I listened to other women talk about partners who destroyed their phones, so they couldn't call for help, who broke dishes and blamed them for buying cheap ones, who systematically ruined everything meaningful until isolation felt easier than explaining why you owned nothing. One woman described how her ex smashed her laptop every time she tried to take online classes, and another talked about coming home to find all her clothes cut up because she'd gone to lunch with a friend. Hearing my own experience reflected in their stories made something loosen in my chest. This shame I'd been carrying that somehow I'd caused Derek's behavior, or deserved it for staying. When it was my turn to share, I told them about the pot and my mom and the empty apartment, and several women nodded like they understood completely. After the meeting ended, 3 different women came up to hug me and say how brave I was for leaving, and I realized that getting out took more strength than I'd given myself credit for. My boss called me into her office on a Thursday morning, and I spent the entire walk down the hallway convinced I was getting fired for all the days I'd called in sick during the worst of everything with Derek. Instead, she offered me a promotion to senior coordinator with a significant pay raise and better benefits. She said she'd noticed positive changes in my work over the past few months, that I seemed more focused and confident, that my ideas in meetings had become sharper and more creative. I thanked her and tried not to cry, but after I left her office, I sat in the bathroom stall for 10 minutes just breathing and processing that Derek's abuse had reached into my professional life too. I'd been so busy managing his moods and replacing destroyed belongings that my career had suffered without me fully realizing it. Getting that promotion felt like reclaiming another piece of myself, proving that I could succeed when I wasn't constantly worried about what would be broken when I got home. Erin from Derek's office sent me an email a few days later with the subject line, "I owe you an apology." He wrote that he'd worked near Derek for 2 years and heard him make comments about his girlfriend being too attached to stuff, about how women needed to learn that possessions weren't important, about how he was teaching me valuable lessons about materialism. Aaron said he'd laughed along or stayed quiet because he thought Derek was just venting about normal relationship stuff. But after the office incident and hearing through company gossip what had really been happening, he felt sick that he hadn't recognized the red flags. He apologized for not saying something sooner, for not questioning Derek's weird attitude about destroying things, for being part of a workplace culture that let Derek's behavior seem normal. Reading Aaron's email made me feel less alone somehow, knowing that other people saw Derek's actions clearly now and understood that I wasn't crazy or oversensitive. I wrote back thanking him for reaching out and saying his apology meant more than he probably realized. I signed up for a pottery class at the community center on Saturday mornings, partly because I wanted to connect with my mom's memory, and partly because I needed to prove to myself that I could create something beautiful that couldn't be taken away. The instructor was this older woman with clay permanently under her fingernails who showed me how to center the clay on the wheel, how to use steady pressure to pull up the walls of a bowl, how to trim and smooth the edges. My first attempts looked terrible, lopsided and uneven with walls that collapsed halfway through, but she just smiled and said everyone's first bowls look like that. Week after week I practiced, getting slightly better each time, learning to feel when the clay was too wet or too dry, when to add pressure and when to ease off. The process of working with my hands and focusing completely on shaping something felt healing in a way I hadn't expected, like I was building new neural pathways that Derek's destruction couldn't reach. 6 months after leaving Derek, I stood in my apartment looking around at the life I'd built. The couch I'd picked out myself sat against the wall with throw pillows I'd chosen because I liked the colors, not because they matched some design scheme Derek approved. Bookshelves held my growing collection of novels I could read without worrying they'd end up in the dumpster, and plants lined the windowsill where my mom's pot used to sit. My kitchen table had 4 matching chairs, and I could eat meals sitting down like a normal person instead of standing at the counter. The bed had a frame and a headboard, and sheets I'd bought because they felt soft, and every single item in my home represented freedom to own things without fear. The apartment wasn't fancy or perfectly decorated, but it was authentically mine, structured around my needs and interests instead of organized around managing someone else's anger. I could buy a coffee mug without calculating whether Derek might throw it, could display photos without wondering if they'd survive the week, could exist in my own space without constantly bracing for destruction. Jacqueline told me over lunch that Derek was dating someone new, and my stomach dropped even though I hadn't thought about him in weeks. My immediate reaction was worry for this other woman, wondering if I should warn her about what Derek would eventually do, if I had some responsibility to prevent her from going through what I'd experienced. I brought it up in therapy that week, and my therapist listened carefully before explaining that I couldn't save someone who wasn't ready to see the truth, that Derek's new girlfriend would have to recognize the red flags herself just like I eventually did. She reminded me that my responsibility was to continue healing myself, not to manage Derek's future relationships, or try to control outcomes I had no power over. The conversation helped me understand that letting go meant accepting I couldn't fix or prevent everything, that some lessons people have to learn on their own, even when it hurts to watch from a distance. The pottery instructor complimented my improvement during class one Saturday, holding up the bowl I'd just finished trimming and pointing out how even the walls were, how smooth the curve from base to rim. I decided to paint sunflowers on it like my mom had done, even though my artistic skills were nowhere near hers, and the flowers came out simpler and less detailed. But when I picked up the finished piece after it came out of the kiln, holding the small bowl I'd created with my own hands and decorated with symbols of my mom's memory, I felt something shift inside me. It wasn't my mom's pot, and it never would be, but it was mine in a way that felt powerful and permanent. Derek couldn't take this from me because I'd made it myself, and creating something beautiful that belonged only to me felt like reclaiming power he'd tried to destroy. I decided to pursue legal action to recover the value of everything Derek had destroyed, not because I expected to actually collect any money, but because I needed him to face consequences and have a legal record of what he'd done. My lawyer filed a civil suit with documentation of every destroyed item over the 2 years we'd lived together, including photos, receipts, estimated replacement costs, and testimony from Delilah and other witnesses who'd seen the damage. The process of listing everything Derek had ruined was both painful and validating, sitting with my lawyer. And going through the inventory of my grandmother's mirror, my laptop, my books, my furniture, my mom's pot, calculating that he'd destroyed over $30,000 worth of my belongings. Each item on that list represented a piece of my life Derek had thrown away, and having it documented officially made his abuse real in a way that couldn't be dismissed or minimized. Derek didn't respond to the civil suit within the required time frame, and the court granted a default judgment in my favor for $32,000 in damages. My lawyer explained that collecting the money would be difficult since Derek had been fired and probably didn't have assets to seize, but having the legal document mattered more to me than the actual payment. The judgment said officially that Derek was wrong, that he'd harmed me, that what he did had real monetary value attached to the destruction. I kept a copy of the court order in my filing cabinet next to the permanent restraining order, these pieces of paper that proved I wasn't crazy or materialistic or too sensitive, that what happened to me was real abuse with real consequences that a judge had recognized and validated. I met someone at the coffee shop where I'd started going every Saturday morning, a guy named Marcus who worked at the bookstore down the street. He asked if the seat across from me was taken, and we ended up talking for 2 hours about nothing important, just movies and favorite foods and the weird weather we'd been having. When he asked for my number, I hesitated, my brain immediately scanning for red flags, watching how he reacted to furniture around us, listening for any edge in his voice. My therapist had warned me about this in our session the week before, explaining that being careful was smart, but I also needed to remember that not every man was Derek, that I deserved to trust my own judgment again without letting fear control every decision I made. Marcus texted the next day asking if I wanted to grab dinner sometime. Nothing fancy, and I said yes, even though my stomach twisted with anxiety about letting someone new into my life. Our first date was casual, pizza at a place near my apartment, and I watched him carefully the whole time. When the waiter brought the wrong order, Marcus just laughed and said it was fine. He'd eat whatever they brought, and that small moment of him not getting angry over something minor made me relax slightly. I told him on our third date that I'd gotten out of a bad relationship recently and needed to take things slow, and he nodded and said that was completely fine. He wasn't in any rush. The relief I felt hearing those words without any pressure or frustration in his response was almost overwhelming. Marcus respected every boundary I set without making me feel broken or difficult about it. When he came to my apartment for the first time, he noticed how carefully I'd arranged everything, how I had photos and plants and books displayed on shelves, and he complimented the space without touching anything unless I offered. Having someone treat my possessions like they mattered, like they weren't just material chains holding me back from enlightenment, felt revolutionary after years of Derek destroying everything I owned. Marcus never raised his voice, never slammed doors when he was frustrated, never made me feel like I was walking on eggshells waiting for his mood to shift. We moved slowly through the relationship, going on dates and talking on the phone and gradually building something that felt safe and genuine instead of intense and consuming. The pottery class ended after 12 weeks and I brought home my final project, the sunflower bowl I'd spent so much time perfecting. I placed it on my kitchen counter where I'd see it every morning while making coffee, this small ceramic piece that represented everything I'd survived and rebuilt. It wasn't my mom's pot and it never would be. The flowers weren't as detailed or skillful as hers had been, but it was mine in a way that felt powerful and permanent. Nobody could take this from me because I'd created it myself, shaped it with my own hands, painted the yellow petals with my own brush. Every time I looked at that bowl, I remembered sitting in the pottery studio with clay under my fingernails, remembered the instructor praising my improvement, remembered choosing to make something beautiful instead of letting Derek's destruction define my entire life. The bowl represented my ability to create meaning and beauty again, and that felt like enough. A mutual friend named Sarah called me one afternoon saying Derek had asked her to pass along a message. My stomach dropped hearing his name, and Sarah quickly explained that she'd told Derek she wasn't comfortable being a messenger, but he'd insisted it was important. Derek wanted to talk because he was doing therapy now, and his counselor had suggested making amends to people he'd hurt, and he thought we should have a conversation about everything that happened. I thanked Sarah for telling me but said I wasn't interested. Then I called my lawyer to ask how to handle this. My lawyer sent Derek's therapist a formal letter explaining that I didn't consent to any contact, that Derek's healing journey was his own responsibility, and that I didn't owe him forgiveness or closure just because he'd decided to work on himself. Making that decision felt strong and clear, recognizing that Derek's therapy didn't obligate me to participate in his recovery or expose myself to him again just so he could feel better about his past behavior. A year after leaving Derek, I moved into a bigger apartment across town, a place with actual space and good light, and a kitchen that could fit a real table. I spent weeks furnishing it exactly how I wanted, buying the expensive coffee maker I'd always wanted. But Derek said was wasteful, hanging art on the walls without worrying someone would punch holes through the frames, displaying my growing book collection on shelves that didn't have to stay empty. I filled the living room with plants, bought a comfortable couch that nobody would throw out a window after a bad day, arranged my dishes in the cabinets knowing they'd still be there tomorrow. Nothing about my home required permission or risked destruction. Every single item I owned was mine to keep and enjoy without fear. The apartment felt like a physical representation of my freedom, each room proof that I'd built a life Derek couldn't touch anymore. Ruth invited me to Sunday dinner at her house, and when I arrived, she pulled me into a hug and held on longer than usual. Over dinner, she mentioned how different I seemed compared to a year ago, lighter and more confident, more like the person I'd been before Derek entered my life. Her observation surprised me because I'd been so focused on the day-to-day work of healing that I hadn't stopped to notice my own growth, but hearing it from someone who'd known me my whole life made the changes feel real and significant. Ruth said she and other family members had worried about me during those years with Derek, but didn't know how to help, and she was grateful I'd found my way out of that relationship even though the path had been painful. I thanked her for waiting patiently instead of pushing, for keeping the door open so I had somewhere safe to return when I was finally ready. The support group facilitator approached me after a meeting and asked if I'd be willing to share my story at their next session for newly leaving survivors. I agreed, even though the idea made me nervous, and 2 weeks later I stood in front of 15 women and talked about Derek destroying my belongings, about my mom's pot, about the revenge and the legal battles and the slow process of rebuilding my life. Several women cried while I spoke, and afterward 3 of them thanked me for helping them feel less alone in their experiences. One woman said hearing that I'd made it to the other side gave her hope that she could too, and knowing my pain could serve a purpose for other survivors made everything I'd been through feel slightly less meaningless. Telling my experience to women who were where I'd been a year ago felt meaningful in a way I hadn't expected. I used part of my promotion raise to create a small scholarship fund at the community center, specifically for domestic violence survivors to take art classes. The pottery instructor cried when I explained why this mattered, understanding that creative expression had been crucial to my healing and wanting other women to have that same opportunity. The center agreed to administer the fund and promote it through local shelters, and within a month 2 women had applied to take the pottery class using the scholarship money. Knowing my experience might help other women heal through creativity gave my pain purpose, transformed Derek's destruction into something that could create beauty and recovery for people I'd never even meet. Marcus and I had been dating for 8 months when I had a panic attack in his apartment over something completely minor. He'd moved a photo frame I'd brought over, and my brain immediately jumped to Derek breaking things, and suddenly I couldn't breathe and tears were running down my face. Marcus sat with me on the floor until I could talk again, and when I explained about Derek and the years of destruction, he listened without judgment and said he understood that my healing was ongoing. We talked openly about my past after that, about the triggers I still dealt with, and the anxiety that sometimes came out of nowhere, and Marcus never complained about my occasional need for reassurance, or the ways trauma still showed up in my daily life. Having a partner who treated my history with respect instead of impatience felt like proof that healthy relationships actually existed. I drove to the cemetery on the anniversary of my mom's death, and sat by her grave with the sunflower bowl I'd made in pottery class. I told her everything that had happened over the past year, about Derek throwing her pot out the window, about destroying his office in revenge, about the legal battles and therapy in pottery class where I'd tried to recreate what he'd taken from me. I told her about Marcus and the new apartment and the scholarship fund, about speaking at the support group and helping other women find their way out of abusive relationships. I told her I was okay now, that I was building a life she'd be proud of, that I'd refuse to let Derek break me completely, even when he'd destroyed the last physical piece of her I had left. Sitting there talking to her felt like closing a circle, like I'd finally honored her memory by surviving and healing instead of staying broken. A few weeks later, Derek's sister sent me a message through social media. She said she was sorry for what her brother did, and that their whole family was trying to get him to see a therapist who could actually help him. I read her message twice, feeling weird about getting an apology from someone who wasn't the person who hurt me. I wrote back and told her I appreciated her reaching out, but that I needed to keep my distance from anything connected to Derek. I explained that I hoped he got the help he needed, but that my job now was protecting my own peace, not worrying about his recovery. She responded right away saying she totally understood and wished me well. It felt good to set that boundary without guilt, to recognize that Derek's healing wasn't my responsibility anymore. At work, my boss called me into her office on a Thursday afternoon. My stomach dropped for a second, that old panic from Derek's days still lurking in my body. But she smiled and told me they were promoting me to senior manager, a position I'd been working toward for over a year. She specifically mentioned my leadership during the difficult client situation last month and said I handled pressure with more grace than anyone else on the team. Sitting there listening to her praise my strength, I realized something surprising. Surviving Derek had taught me skills I never wanted to learn, but they made me better at my job. I knew how to stay calm when people got angry. I knew how to set firm boundaries. I knew how to protect myself while still getting things done. I was channeling all that pain into building a career that actually made me proud. 2 years after I left that empty apartment where Derek broke everything I owned, my life looked completely different. I had a home filled with furniture I picked out myself, plants that nobody threw away when they had a bad day, art on the walls that stayed there. My career was thriving in ways I couldn't have imagined back when I was too anxious about Derek's moods to focus on work. I had friends who visited regularly, family I saw on weekends, a partner who treated my things and my feelings with respect. But the most important thing I got back was myself. Derek tried so hard to destroy the person I was, to make me believe I deserved his treatment, to convince me that caring about my possessions made me shallow and materialistic. He failed. I was still here, stronger than before, building a life he couldn't touch. The sunflower bowl from pottery class still sat on my kitchen counter where I saw it every morning. Over the past year, I'd made more pieces in class, gotten better at working with clay, created a whole collection of handmade things that filled my shelves. My apartment wasn't just full of store-bought items anymore. It had things I made with my own hands, things that represented my creativity and my healing, and my absolute freedom to build whatever life I wanted. Every bowl and mug and vase proved that Derek couldn't break me permanently, that I could create beauty even after everything he destroyed. That was worth more than anything he ever took from me.